Imagine walking into a dealership and seeing a brand new electric car for around $10,000. Not a used car, not a stripped-down golf cart, a real, modern EV with a lithium iron phosphate battery, hundreds of kilometers of claimed range, and even advanced driver assistance technology available on some versions. That might sound impossible in most parts of the world, but in China, it's already happening. The 2026 BYD Seagull starts at 69,900 yuan, roughly $10,300 at current exchange rates. And that's not even the cheapest electric car China is producing. The Wuling Hongguang Mini EV starts at roughly $6,000, while Geely's Panda Mini is around $6,500. So China hasn't just made EVs cheaper, it may have changed the definition of what an affordable new car can be. And that raises a much bigger question. What does a $10,000 EV in China actually mean for you? Because the answer isn't simply, you'll be able to buy one for $10,000. The real story is much bigger. Let's start with the car that has attracted much of the attention, the BYD Seagull. For 2026, the Seagull starts at 69,900 yuan, which works out to around $10,300. The entry-level version has a 30.1 kilowatt-hour LFP battery and a claimed CLTC range of about 305 kilometers. Higher versions use a 38.9 kilowatt-hour battery and can claim up to 405 kilometers of CLTC range. And here's the part that makes the price even more surprising. BYD has brought advanced driver assistance hardware, including LiDAR on certain versions, into this tiny car segment. With the optional system, some versions remain below 100,000 yuan, roughly $14,700. Now obviously, this isn't a $10,000 luxury sedan, it's a small city hatchback. But that's exactly the point. China isn't trying to make a $10,000 EV that replaces a Mercedes. It's creating a vehicle that handles the basic transportation job at an incredibly low price. And once that becomes normal, the entire automotive market starts looking different. If you think $10,000 is the floor, think again. The 2026 Wuling Hongguang Mini EV starts at around $6,000 in China. Its higher versions can provide up to around 301 kilometers of claimed CLTC range while using an LFP battery. Then there's the Geely Panda Mini. The 2026 model is listed around 43,900 yuan, or roughly $6,500, with a 17.2 kilowatt-hour LFP battery and a claimed range of 210 kilometers. These cars aren't designed to cross continents. They're designed for something much simpler: going to work, running errands, picking up your kids, driving around the city. And that's important because a huge portion of people's daily driving doesn't actually require a giant battery or 500 horsepower. It requires a cheap, reliable way to get from A to B. China has realized that, and it's building cars around that reality. So how are they so cheap? This is where the story gets really interesting. A $10,000 EV isn't possible simply because a company decided to make less profit. China has spent years building an enormous EV supply chain: battery manufacturing, electric motors, power electronics, semiconductors, raw material processing, vehicle assembly, and increasingly, the software that controls the entire vehicle. Instead of importing many of these components, Chinese manufacturers can source enormous portions of the vehicle domestically. That creates scale, and scale drives costs down. BYD is an excellent example because its business extends far beyond simply assembling cars. It produces batteries through its FinDreams battery business, develops its own electric drive technology, and has built an enormous manufacturing ecosystem around electrification. The result is a level of vertical integration that traditional automakers have struggled to match. And batteries are particularly important because in an EV, the battery is one of the biggest components determining the vehicle's cost. When battery technology becomes cheaper, smaller, and more efficient, the entire vehicle can become cheaper. China's enormous battery industry has therefore become one of its biggest competitive advantages. There's a common explanation for cheap Chinese cars. China just has cheaper workers. That's too simplistic. Labor matters, but it isn't the whole story. The bigger advantage is the ecosystem. Imagine you're trying to build an EV. You need batteries, a battery supplier, a motor supplier, a power electronics supplier, software engineers, chip suppliers, metal components, interior components, charging equipment, factories, logistics, and thousands of other parts. If your suppliers are nearby, your development cycle gets faster. If your supplier can modify a component specifically for your vehicle, development gets faster again. And if you can produce millions of vehicles, you can spread development and manufacturing costs across enormous volumes. That's the advantage China has spent years building. And it's one reason Chinese automakers can move from concept to production incredibly quickly. Reuters recently reported that Chinese automakers are leveraging their strong electrification capabilities and comprehensive supply chains as they expand overseas. So the $10,000 EV isn't really one technological breakthrough. It's the result of an entire industrial system working together. But here's the catch. $10,000 in China doesn't mean $10,000 everywhere. Now we need to clear up one very important misconception. If a Seagull costs around $10,000 in China, that does not mean you can walk into a dealership in America tomorrow and buy one for $10,000. Far from it. Once you add transportation, taxes, regulations, dealer costs, distribution, tariffs, and other market-specific expenses, the price can change dramatically. And some markets have very different safety and regulatory requirements. The United States is an especially difficult market for Chinese-made EVs because of trade restrictions and tariffs. Europe is more accessible, but it isn't completely open either. The European Union has imposed additional duties on certain Chinese-made EVs, with rates varying by manufacturer. And yet, despite those barriers, Chinese EVs are still gaining ground. In the first 5 months of 2026, Chinese brands accounted for 14.2% of battery electric vehicle sales in Western Europe, according to The Guardian's reporting. That tells us something important. The real threat isn't necessarily that a $10,000 Chinese EV will suddenly flood every American dealership. The threat is that the cost structure behind these cars is forcing the rest of the industry to rethink what an affordable EV should cost. Think about what happens when consumers discover that an EV can be built for $10,000. Suddenly, a $40,000 EV doesn't look quite as inevitable. Of course, larger vehicles require larger batteries. More powerful motors cost more. Safety equipment costs money. Long-range vehicles cost more. And a compact Chinese city EV isn't directly comparable with a large American crossover. But the psychological effect is still powerful. It creates a new benchmark. If Chinese automakers can sell a small EV at around $10,000 in their home market, competitors have to ask, why can't we get closer to that? And that pressure can move through the entire market. Automakers may have to simplify vehicles, reduce manufacturing costs, develop smaller batteries, increase vertical integration, use cheaper LFP chemistry, automate more production, and rethink which features consumers actually need. The result could eventually be more affordable EVs across multiple markets. Here's an interesting twist. You don't have to be an EV enthusiast to benefit from this. Why? Because EV competition puts pressure on the entire automotive market. If electric cars become dramatically cheaper, traditional automakers can't simply ignore them. They have to respond. And that means cheaper EVs, better hybrids, more efficient gasoline vehicles, or some combination of all three. Competition is the important part. For years, one of the biggest barriers to EV adoption has been price. If that barrier starts disappearing, millions more consumers suddenly become potential EV buyers. And that changes the economics of transportation. A person who couldn't afford a $35,000 EV might seriously consider a $15,000 or $20,000 one. A family that needs a second car might choose a tiny EV for commuting. A city driver might decide there's no reason to spend extra money on a large gasoline vehicle when most of their trips are short. That's where affordable EVs could become genuinely disruptive. But there's another problem. Can China sell them everywhere? This is where geopolitics enters the story. China's automakers increasingly need overseas markets. Domestic competition in China is brutal. Reuters reported that Chinese vehicle exports surged dramatically in July 2026, even as domestic sales weakened, highlighting how important overseas markets have become. And those companies aren't just selling cars, they're building factories overseas, creating partnerships, buying manufacturing facilities, and adapting vehicles for local markets. Europe is one of the biggest battlegrounds. Chinese brands including BYD, Geely, SAIC, Chery, Xpeng, and others are expanding their presence. And some are even moving production into Europe to get around trade barriers and become more locally integrated. So the future may not be China exports a $10,000 car everywhere. It could instead be China teaches the world how to build a much cheaper EV and then builds those cars closer to the customers. That's potentially much more difficult for established automakers to stop. What this means for the US? For American consumers, the immediate impact is less obvious. The US market has much higher barriers to Chinese-made EVs. So don't expect to see a $6,000 Wuling or $10,000 Seagull suddenly appear at your local dealership. But that doesn't mean America's isolated from the trend. American automakers are watching the same cost curve. They're watching battery prices. They're watching Chinese manufacturing. They're watching smaller EVs become increasingly sophisticated. And they're trying to figure out how to compete. The interesting question isn't, will America import China's $10,000 EV? The better question is, will American automakers eventually be forced to build something like it? Because that's where the real disruption could happen. For years, the EV industry has competed around bigger batteries, longer range, faster acceleration, and more technology. But China's cheapest EVs point toward a different future. Smaller batteries, smaller cars, lower prices, simple transportation, and massive production volume. The Wuling Mini EV proves that millions of consumers don't necessarily need a 500-kilometer luxury EV. They need something affordable. The BYD Seagull takes that concept a step further by bringing a more conventional small hatchback, better range, and increasingly sophisticated technology into the same low-cost philosophy. And that's why the $10,000 EV matters. It's not because everyone is suddenly going to buy one. It's because it demonstrates what is technically and commercially possible. So here's the thing. China didn't just crack the $10,000 EV. It cracked something more important. The idea that electric cars have to be expensive. And if that idea spreads around the world, the biggest change may not be the number of EVs on the road. It could be the price of every car on the road. Because once consumers know that a functional electric car can be built for around $10,000, they're going to start asking a very uncomfortable question. Why are other cars so expensive? And that's exactly why China's cheapest EVs could become one of the biggest threats to the traditional auto industry. If you want to see just how serious that threat is becoming, watch our next video, Why This Chinese EV Terrifies Europe's Biggest Car Makers. Because this isn't just about cheap cars anymore. It's about who controls the future of the global auto industry. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to EV Frontier for more stories about the EVs changing the world. Stay charged.